Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by writer and director Sabrina Doyle to talk all about her latest film, Lorelei. And I was so interested in the genesis of this film because there was a conversation that you had with Andrew Zimmerman, who ended up being one of the producers on the film, in which he said that we never really get the opportunity to see male characters like the central character in this Wayland, raising children and becoming a parent to non-biological kids. And so I was really interested in how you took the idea of that as a central character and then really took that and fleshed it out in all of the different ways that you did and developed this really, beautifully emotional story between these two central characters in this family.
Yeah, Arnie was the executive producer and financier of the project, and he had wanted to make a film about a stepfather because he had been a stepfather in his own life. He had raised four children who were not his biological children, never had children of his own, and so really wanted to felt that kind of male character, the softness, the tenderness that comes with learning to love children who are not your flesh and blood. He felt he hadn't seen that kind of American male in a film before. So that's kind of so making a film around that character was really the genesis of the story, because I met him, we got on, and we decided to sort of embark on this adventure together. And he's an older guy, he's in his 70s and sort of had been a businessman his whole life, and just really wanted to make a movie, and I love that idea as well, this idea of sort of second chances and doing something a bit later in life, because it kind of ties in with the theme of Lorelei as well. And I don't feel in life we talk enough about our failures. We're so success driven, social media makes that, exacerbates that, and those impressions. And so I think so that's the kind of character that we started with. And then I knew, because of my background, I grew up in a working class British family, immigrant family. My father was Irish, my mother was Italian. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, secondary school, and so I grew up in that kind of family, and I feel that the depictions of blue collar families that I see on film are not always satisfying to me, having grown up like that, because I feel they're either very issue oriented, and they, in order to kind of get their message across, they need to put the characters through so much misery, and it's very misery driven. And I think that takes away, honestly, that turns the sort of characters into vessels for a message, and it takes away their humanity a little bit. It kind of flattens them out, takes away the sort of dimensionality of the characters. And because I think the lives are much richer than that, and definitely have bumps and definitely have low points, but there's also a lot of joy. And there's also, and the big thing I wanted to do with Lorelei was really foreground the resilience and the dream life and the inner life of the characters. Because for myself growing up, stories were really foundational to me. Like I was a big daydreamer. I always staged little plays. I didn't know about filmmaking or directing or anything like that growing up. I definitely had that instinct. I would always direct my siblings in little plays and stuff. And I had a big imagination, and I think I think my imagination and the story bit of my brain enabled me to kind of imagine a different life than maybe the one that you would expect from someone from my background. And so I was kind of able, and not to put too fine a point on it, but sort of dream my way into a different life. I ended up going to sort of Cambridge. I ended up getting a Fulbright to come to the US to go to film school here. And now I'm, I've made a film, which is not necessarily what you'd expect from someone from my background. So, for me, stories are really important. And for me, the transformation of life into a story, into a fable, into a myth, I think that's really important. So I call this film a working class fable. And that's kind of, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a film about the working classes, about a blue collar family that had this fable-like quality that really kind of foregrounds their resilience and their dream life and their ability to really dream big, even when life tries to keep them small and constrained.
And you mentioned there the dimensionality of the characters in it, and that's one of the things that I found so striking about the film is so frequently it would be told only from Wayland's perspective or only from Dolores's perspective, and the other one would feel much more of a supporting character, but you really fleshed both of them out so richly. And then even when you look at Dolores's kids, all three of them have such unique identities, and they don't just appear on screen for a moment to support another character as well. They're such a central core to the story for both of these characters as well. And I read that part of your process in that was doing passes on the script where you would do a Wayland pass and go through, and then you do one with the kids going through with just them. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about what that looked like in terms of your writing process as you were fleshing them all out.
That was my big takeaway from the screenwriting process. I mean, I sort of share this with everyone I can, because it was such a revelation to me that if you do a pass where you're focused on one. So your first, everyone's first draft of a screenplay is rubbish. I mean, it just is. It's full of cliches. It's full of, you're literally just vomiting stuff out on the page. It's mostly stuff that you've kind of cobbled together from, other films. So it's kind of, it feels hackneyed. It feels stale, but it kind of you have to start somewhere. And then once you've got that down, writing is rewriting, and you just have to chip away, you have to just have pass after pass after pass at it. But I discovered in the process of writing Lorelei that instead of, if I didn't do a global pass, if I did passes that were focused on very specific things, and in this case, very specific characters, that it got me a lot further. So I did, I definitely did a pass where I was focused on Wayland and his arc. And then I was very unsatisfied with Dolores. And I felt, as a kind of feminist, that I did not want that character. My sort of pet peeve in films is having the girlfriend or wife character literally just, be there to kind of be the moral conscience of the guy and exist only to kind of support his arc and his journey. And I thought, well, Dolores should have her own journey and her own dreams and her own arc and her own, and it should not necessarily, it shouldn't necessarily be complementary to Wayland's arc. In fact, she should maybe be an antagonist in some ways. I mean, she's what he wants, and she's kind of this object of, love and desire, but she's also an antagonist. And I think, and she also gets in his way, and he gets in her way. And I kind of felt that was more honest. I felt that gave sort of dimensionality to the female character that I really wanted. So I definitely discovered in the process of kind of writing this. And I often feel, when you watch films, you often feel like characters in the films kind of, they exist to fulfill a structural purpose in the story. They kind of, why that character exists, and it's to kind of give the main character, an obstacle at this point in the story, or it's to give the main character reassurance and encouragement at a certain point in the story. And it was my sort of intention, or it was my hope writing Lorelei, that I could make every character, even if you only saw them for a very small amount of time, that in another film they could have been the main character, that they had lives of their own. And there's a bit at the end of the movie where Pastor Gale, the sort of the pastor who kind of runs the halfway house, and she says to Wayland, she reveals a bit of her backstory to Wayland, and he's really surprised because they have something in common, and she sort of says, story for another day. And I really like that idea. I really like the idea that in another film she might have been the main character. And so I kind of tried to write every character kind of like that, just to give them a little bit of specificity, so that they would feel, and as part of that, I didn't want to vilify anyone, even the motorcycle club, which in a different version of this story, they could have been the baddies, and they could have been pulling Wayland back into a life of crime. And, when I was sort of researching this film, and I was traveling up to Oregon to kind of meet people in the motorcycle community and just kind of hear about their lives, it was, it just occurred to me that that was not the case, that there is, that a lot of these sort of motorcycle clubs, often do hold events for charities and children's charities, and kind of raise money for, there's a fundraiser in the film for like a kid who's sick, and they often do stuff like that. So even though, some versions of motorcycle clubs do, hover on the edges of criminality, that there is also this other side to them as well. And so I just wanted to show complexity with every kind of character in the film, and that was really important to me.
In the center of this film is these two characters who haven't been together for 15 years, and they're rediscovering everything. And it seems like they're about 18 when they were last together as well, which is such an interesting age, because you think that you know who you are when you're that age, but you're still really figuring out so many elements of who you're going to be as a person. And you really have them fall back into familiar habits, but also try to bridge the gap of time and fill in some of the uncertainties with each other. And so I wanted to ask about the dance of figuring out what that dynamic between the two of them was going to be, and what some of that familiarity between them would look like, especially very early on, and then where the gaps and the spaces would start to exist.
I mean, it's interesting, it's interesting that you say that. I think it's probably the most intense time of your life, right? Like the memories you have of that period, sort of those late teenage years, I suppose, are kind of the most intense you'll ever have. You feel the most alive you ever feel. so of course there's a natural desire to want to go back to that, right? And I think with what Wayland and Dolores realize is that, you know, so they had this intense relationship, and that was never kind of, you know, that was never allowed to flourish, that was kind of interrupted by him going to prison. But they can't go back to that. They can't go back to who they were. Because if there's any certainty at all in life, and that, you know, it's the certainty that things change, you know, I mean, nothing stays the same. And I think really the film is kind of both of them in some ways coming to terms with that idea, and coming to terms with the fact that the film is about embracing the life you have now, I suppose, rather than the life you wish you could have had. You know, Wayland becomes a father in the film in ways that he might not have imagined he would have become a father. And once he allows him, you know, part of what I wanted to explore with the film was this idea of, you know, I call it toxic nostalgia, because I think nostalgia can be a very wonderful, beautiful thing. It can give us a sense of the story of our lives and the things that we lose, and the sort of, you know, the ecstasy of kind of having loved and having lost. And nostalgia can give you all of that, and it can be a very beautiful thing, I think. But I think it can also be a very ugly thing, because I think it can pull us back into sort of regressive ideas. And, you know, I certainly, when I was writing this in 2016, I felt I was hearing a lot, you know, like in the UK, like at home with Brexit, even just let's go back to how we were, let's go back to how the UK was and how Great Britain was, you know, and you know, similar sentiments, of course, you know, across the world, in the US and across the world. And, you know, just this kind of backward looking mentality. And I thought, oh, that's so, and I thought, how can I tell that without being too overtly political? How can I do that? How can I tell that story on a familial level? And how can I show, and you know, the idea of this guy who ends up embracing children, the children who represent the future in this film, you know, rather than the past, you know, and there's reference for the past, there's respect for the past, there's nostalgia for the past in the film. There's definitely a longing for the past in the film, but ultimately the characters can only move forward once they accept that they are where they're at, and they're never going to get that back. And they had it, but they don't have it now, but they have something else now. So I think, and that feels, you know, I always look, the films I really love are always films that give me some kind of existential kind of comfort. And I find that a comforting idea, you know, so you always make films in the image of films that you love. And I think that, you know, I think the films that I really love are films that kind of deal with these kinds of big ideas. And so in a way, I wanted to do that on a sort of very intimate, familial level and within this setting. So that was all folded into that. And that's how that happened.
And then I wanted to talk about a lot of the camera framing and the way that you use camera placement and what is in the frame to really tell a story, because it seems like you've even used that in terms of the theme of Wayland coming out of prison, and he almost becomes more free in the way that you frame him throughout the film. Whereas when Dolores is longing for the past a little bit more, then the camera gets a little bit tighter on her. And there's a lot of elements, even just in terms of how you wanted to have prison, you know, callbacks to prison, such as having a character stand in a door frame or having, you know, lined elements at the edge of a frame. So I was just very interested in how you use those elements so specifically to talk about these two characters and the different journeys that they're going on together.
My God, thank you for noticing that. I feel like that's the kind of thing that we filmmakers kind of, I mean, that was all in my look. So I made a lookbook before we shot the film, and in my lookbook I had, you know, that we would frame Wayland at the beginning of the film inside kind of boxes and inside, you know, kind of vertical lines that would sort of represent prison. And that by, you know, as he becomes a bit freer, she starts feeling restless. And so then we start entrapping her in a way in these lines. And, you know, there's a scene in which she realizes that she hasn't got the money to buy her daughter a birthday present. And she thought she had the money in her wallet, and she doesn't have it. And so at that point in that scene, she sort of goes to her job in a motel and she lights a cigarette. And as she's lighting a cigarette, we see her through these lines. I mean, there's a kind of fence, I suppose, there's a sort of railing, and we see her through the lines in the railing. And so she's behind those prison bars in a way, she's trapped. And that was all kind of deliberate. But I just always feel so grateful when people notice that kind of thing. I mean, I do wonder, I mean, I think people feel it probably subliminally, even if they can't put a word to it. And so, you know, those elements of visual storytelling are just kind of, you know, really important to me. I really like I really like the medium of cinema. I really like the language of cinema. I really like sort of turning things into, you know, turning ideas and turning emotions into pieces of cinema, you know. And sometimes, you know, sometimes you can do stuff with dialogue and sometimes you can do stuff without dialogue. And I think that, you know, I love words, but I also love images. And so, so there was definitely a sense that, you know, another idea that we sort of played with was sort of, you know, locking off the camera, you know, having the camera sort of be more fluid when the children were around versus sort of locked off cameras when there was sort of stasis, or there's, you know, something was stuck, or, you know, the characters were stuck. So, you know, that the children would sort of represent this kind of, you know, this fast flowing river, this kind of motion, this change, this sort of relentless charge towards the future, but that the characters themselves would be rooted and stuck. And so we kind of played with movement a little bit like that as well.
Yeah, and the kids who are the young performers in the film are really astonishing, and I know that it was their first time for all of them acting in a feature film, and also the two younger ones actually knew each other and were friends, which I thought was so interesting given the dynamic that they have together. What were some of the things that you did in terms of having them spend time together and doing certain acting exercises within their characters before you started filming, so that they would have that intrinsic bond on screen and that all of that would come through?
So with Sabina Friedman Seitz, who plays Layla in the movie, but was also our associate producer, Sabina's a sort of classically trained actress, and she and I kind of did little workshops with the children in the weeks leading up to production, where you know, I mean, they'd never been on a film set before, so just we did some basics. We were like, this is what a camera looks like. This is how close the camera is going to get to your face. Please don't look at the camera. You know, this is why we're going to have to do the same scene over and over and over and over again. And you're going to feel a bit nervous. And this is how it'll feel in your body to be nervous. And this is how we can shake some of the nerves away. And we do like shake it out exercises and kind of just exercises just really, you know, that really just to get the kids feeling comfortable in their bodies. And then we got them to imagine their backstories. So, you know, with Amelia, who plays Perry, for example, we had her imagine what her last birthday had been like, and, you know, why she holds so much resentment towards her mother. And maybe, you know, is she the kid who always gets the, you know, the crappy presents, the rubbish presents? You know, is she the one, does she feel that she's been singled out in some way? And we got her to imagine her, you know, other incidents maybe before the story in the film starts that may have happened between her and her mother. And kids have tremendous imaginations, and that it's such a joy to work with them, because it's easy to get them to imagine stuff. I mean, they were, you know, there was no kind of, you know, you gave them that prompt and they were away and they imagined. And so they kind of believed, once they believed the imaginary circumstances of the story and they understood the imaginary circumstances of the story, they were just able to react authentically. And I just always think that the joy of working with kids is that, you know, as adults, we kind of put on a bit of an act, don't we? We all do. We don't want to sort of be seen. We're scared for people to see us as we really are, I think. I mean, we because so many of our feelings are sort of around fear or shame or, you know, feelings of inadequacy or whatever it is. And we try and sort of hide that. And kids don't do that as much. I think they're just a bit more, they have less of a wall up. They have less, their emotions are a bit more honest, especially when they're younger. And so I think that it was really, you know, they were just really honest. You know, you put them in imaginary circumstances that they believe, and they just react authentically and honestly. And Amelia said to me the other day, she said, in that scene where I'm arguing with Dolores and I throw the vase, at the end of one of the takes, I found myself crying, and I don't know why I was crying. And I said, because you were in the moment, and in the moment it felt right to cry, and you cried. You didn't plan it. It just happened because you really believed what was happening in that moment. And so, honestly, I just feel that I learned as much from them as they did from me. It's a real, you know, to have that touchstone of the kids and their emotional honesty was really, and they're honest on set. When they're tired on set, they're tired. You know, it's an interesting thing working with film with children, because they have, you know, they don't have the same sort of, I suppose, you know, they get tired a lot quicker, you know, and film days are long days. And so, you know, you kind of have to, and, you know, in terms of the emotional honesty of children, they're, you know, if they're tired, they're able to hide that less. It just shows more. So they're just, you know, so so that was all interesting. And then Pablo and Jenna were just so great with the kids. Like, I just think of one scene in particular where Jenna, the scene where Denham has to spit at Dolores because Dolores is trying to force Denham into wearing trousers pants, and Denham doesn't like that and doesn't want to, and so they have a big fight, and Denham prefers to wear dresses, and so they have a big fight, and Denham spits at Dolores. And obviously for a kid like Parker, who's so well brought up, so polite, so lovely, that was a really hard thing to ask them to do, to kind of spit at an adult like that, at an adult that they like and admire. And so Jenna was, you know, and Pablo did this as well in sort of equivalent scenes, but Jenna sort of said to Parker, hey, just let's, you know, she turned it into a game. She sort of said, come on, let's practice spitting at me. Come on, do it for real. And is that all you've got? You've got more spit in your mouth than that. And she kind of really sort of demystified it and took away the taboo and kind of really turned it into a game. So I had a lot of help. And of course, she was a child actor herself in her life, so she knew exactly what the kids were going through. So I had a lot of help from the two sort of leads with the kids as well, which was really invaluable.
Yeah. And in working with Jenna Malone and Pablo Schreiber, you know, one of the ways that Pablo always approaches roles is through the physical elements, and you can really see the transformation into Wayland in this film. And Jenna's always kind of talked a lot about being a very intuitive actor. And so as a director and working with the two of them and them having slightly different styles, I was interested in ultimately what the collaborative style that they came up with together ended up being as you worked on scenes together and shooting.
It's funny because I think Pablo had a background he started in theatre, so his very first roles were theatre roles. He's a Tony nominated actor, and then he did The Wire, and he sort of moved into TV and film, and but has a kind of rigor that comes from, I think, theatre. And then Jenna started acting as a child, so out of that place of pure instinct, as children do, as we just talked about. And kind of, it was interesting because I think that those two kind of, you could say contrasting, but you could also say complementary styles of acting, actually, I think created that really particular chemistry that they have in this film, where there is this kind of, there's this charge between them, and the charge comes from their differences as well as their similarities. And the kind of, you know, I think chemistry isn't necessarily always about kind of love, right? It's about love with just the right amount of friction. And so I think that the contrasting styles really help that. And the contrasting styles of acting really help that. And they, you know, I mean, and he, you know, he, as you say, he really likes to kind of transform physically. I think he starts with the physicality of the character. And I think Wayland's physicality is so interesting. He's such a big guy. He towers over the children. He towers over Dolores. He's 6'5". And he wears this hulking great black coat the whole time. So he's kind of walking around like a bogeyman or something, but he's kind of, but there's a sort of, you know, eventually, you know, and he could be threatening, but he, you know, ultimately he isn't. And so I think the physicality, you know, I mean, I know that in other roles he's latched onto those physical elements. And we talked with Lorelei, I mean, he's so cut and he's so lean and he works out so much, but with Lorelei he put on quite a bit of weight so he could look like someone who'd worked out in prison, who'd benched in prison, who kind of used, you know, weightlifting as a way of getting through prison, but not in a sort of Hollywood way where he has a sort of trainer and is kind of very lean and kind of chiseled. So he's big, but he's strong, but he's not, but he, you know, but that, you know, he looks like a real person. So that was his kind of transformation. And he'd sort of grown up in the Pacific Northwest and had grown up seeing sort of bikers around the place and kind of had sort of, you know, definitely had ideas about that. And then when he arrived and you know, the beard and sort of the facial hair, and we talked about that, and the tattoos as well. And then when he came up to Portland to shoot, we had him come to a motorcycle club that agreed to sort of host him for an evening, and he was able to go to a real motorcycle club and attend a real sort of evening there, and just talk to those guys about, you know, their culture, and just sort of watch them as well and sort of see how they held themselves and conducted themselves. So he did that kind of, so that was really helpful, I think, for him. And Jenna's just like this kind of whirlwind of an actress. She brings sort of unpredictability. She brings kind of, you know, she's kind of a force of nature. And I think you see that in Dolores's character, right? When she really let rip with that, she really let that kind of, you know, like I think in some roles in the past, she's been sort of more controlled and more poised. And with Dolores, you know, we talked before production, we talked about really just like letting Dolores be a bit wild and kind of, and she isn't, and I love that. I love that about the character. I love the moments when she's unhinged. And I think that, you know, for Jenna, that was a really sort of fun, almost new thing that she was able to do in this film. So, you know, I think for both of them, the story is personal. You know, they're both parents. Jenna's a single mother and has kind of been very honest about how hard it is to be a single mother, and kind of this was her first major role back after having her child. And so it was, she was struggling to kind of manage, or she was figuring out rather how to manage kind of being a mother and being a working actor. And so the sort of struggles of Dolores as a single mother really felt personal to her as well.
And then lastly, you've talked about how as a director and as a filmmaker, you always really think beyond the limits of what should be in place when you're making films. When you look at a film like this, there's obvious constraints like budget, the amount of time for a 25-day shoot. You ended up shooting in multiple locations at the same time. And so what are a lot of the spaces in which you felt like you really, really pushed yourself beyond what the limitations and constraints almost should have been in making this film?
It was really, this was a very low budget film, and I like spectacle. I know you can make a great film that's a sort of interesting character study that can be very intimate. But and I like those films, but I also have, I think, a bit more of, as we discussed before, I think, the imagination is really important to me, and I think I have a bit more of an expansive imagination. And so for me, being able to do some kind of big cinematic set pieces was really important, and to have moments of kind of visual storytelling that would kind of sweep you away into another world. And so part of that, and so a lot of that for me came from the Americana of the film, the kind of the misty forests that kind of shrouded in mist, and the mist is kind of hiding something mysterious. I think Twin Peaks is probably in my head a lot as something I was watching when I was growing up that kind of really influenced this idea of the woods and the vistas of the Pacific Northwest, hiding some dreams or some dream life or some dream reality underneath the mist and underneath the beauty. So I think that was in my head, as and that kind of informed probably a lot of the decision to shoot in the Pacific Northwest, as well as just the proximity to LA and being able to kind of do constant trips up and down prior to shooting, so that I could research the area and research the communities that we would be filming in. And then, but I wanted to do the big set pieces. I wanted to do the big biker stuff. I wanted to do the reason we were able to do those biker set pieces with all those bikes was because we kind of made the time prior to production to making friends in that community. And we befriended this guy who ended up being our picture vehicle coordinator called Tony Mothershead. And we met him randomly. We were going to, Sabrina and I, the associate producer, were going to biker bars, just trying to meet bikers, and, meeting with a little bit of suspicion. They were like, who are you? Are these people cops? It's very, and we said, no, we're making a film, which I think sounds a bit unlikely, but anyway, and we ended up meeting this woman in a bar, and she said, well, what are you guys doing here? You look a bit out of place. And we're like, well, we're looking for bikers. And she's like, oh, these aren't real bikers. I know some real bikers. Let me FaceTime one. And she FaceTimes Tony, who's in bed. And she says, oh, these chicks are making a movie. They want to talk to you. Will you meet with them? And he was like, oh, sure. And he did meet with us. And I think it took him a while to sort of figure out that we were legit and kind of, but once they trusted us and we won their trust, they really pitched in, and they really helped us just because they wanted to, and so on that day where we shot the biker scene, the biker party at the biker club, at the motorcycle club, I came onto set that morning terrified, because I thought how am I going to do this if there aren't enough motorcycles? How am I going to do this if it doesn't feel like a big raucous party? And I show up, and there's all this chrome gleaming in the sunlight, and there are all these bikes there. All these local bikers have shown up for the film and have come out to support us, and they're really happy. They're really happy to show off their bikes, right? So even more exciting for them than being extras in a film is their bikes being in a film, because they're so proud of their bikes. They're often sort of customized bikes, and they've done work on them. And so I think more exciting for them than themselves being in the movie is their bike being in the movie. And they were really happy just to show off their bikes. And so I was very emotional that day, because I thought, there's no way like financially, just with the budget we had, that we would have been able to, if we hadn't had that support from the community, been able to do that scene. And that's kind of true across the board, that we just, the support that we got from like folks up in Oregon really helped us kind of, elevate this film beyond what we could have reasonably expected for a film of its budget. So, it's really about all the people that just kind of came out and supported. And it takes a village. It's not just a sort of small number of individuals. And the number of people. I think we've got the longest thank you list of any movie. I mean, our thank you list is absurd, but it's true. And there are the crew members and everyone that kind of worked on the movie formally, but then we got so much love and so much support from the community. And so I think that kind of, it wasn't so much me pushing as them helping. So and that kind of, for an independent film, for a film of this size, that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's so special when that sort of support and community comes together. And I think you've done something really beautiful in the way that you've made this film and told this story. So congratulations on all of that. And thank you so much, Sabrina.
Oh, thank you. It was lovely chatting.